If you were a Marine at Con Thien in the fall of 1967, the math was simple and terrifying. Every single day, an average of between 100 and 200 artillery shells fell on your position. Some days that number climbed past 1,000. And this wasn't random harassment fire. This was deliberate, sustained bombardment designed to break you psychologically before it killed you physically. For 3 months, Marines at this isolated hilltop fortress endured what many who were there would later call worse than Khe Sanh. And that's saying something, because Khe Sanh became the siege that defined the war in the American public's mind. But the Marines who lived through both will tell you that Con Thien was different. At Khe Sanh, you at least had bunkers deep enough to survive direct hits. At Con Thien, the red clay soil was so thin over solid rock that you couldn't dig more than a few feet down before hitting bedrock, which meant that when those North Vietnamese 130mm guns opened up from across the DMZ, there was nowhere to hide that could actually save you. Now, before we get into what those 3 months of hell were actually like, we need to understand why this particular hill mattered enough for both sides to turn it into a killing ground. And that takes us back to one of the war's most controversial decisions, a decision that would doom the Marines on that hill to months of suffering that could have been avoided entirely. The story of Con Thien starts with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and his obsession with numbers, technology, and the idea that you could build a physical barrier to stop infiltration from North Vietnam. In 1966, McNamara pushed for what became known as the McNamara Line, officially called the Strong Point Obstacle System. The concept was straightforward on paper. Build a line of fortified bases stretching from the coast to the Laotian border, string them together with sensors, minefields and barbed wire, and you'd cut off the North Vietnamese army's infiltration routes into South Vietnam. Con Thien, which translates to Hill of Angels, sat right in the middle of this planned barrier system, just 2 miles south of the Demilitarized Zone and 14 miles from the coast. The hill itself rose only 158 meters above the surrounding terrain, but in the flat coastal plain near the DMZ, that was high enough to matter. From Con Thien's crest, you could see into North Vietnam. You could observe enemy movements, direct artillery fire, and theoretically control the approaches from the north. The Marines established the base in early 1967 as part of a string of strongpoints that included Geo Lin to the east, Cam Lo to the south, and the Rock Pile further west. The base was supposed to be temporary, just another fire support base in a region full of them. But McNamara's barrier concept changed everything. General William Westmoreland, overall commander of US forces in Vietnam, hated the McNamara Line. So did the Marine commanders who would have to man it. They argued correctly that static defences in Vietnam were invitations to disaster. The French had tried the same thing at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, concentrating their forces in a single fortified valley surrounded by hills. The Viet Minh dragged artillery into those hills piece by piece and turned the French position into a shooting gallery. The parallels to what McNamara wanted to do along the DMZ were obvious to anyone who'd studied the earlier war. But McNamara had President Johnson's ear, and the barrier got the green light. The North Vietnamese understood immediately what the Americans were building and what it meant. If the McNamara Line was ever completed, it would make large-scale infiltration much harder and force them to rely more heavily on the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos, which was longer, more difficult, and increasingly dangerous thanks to American air power. So they made a decision. They would destroy the barrier before it could be finished, and they would start by making Con Thien uninhabitable. General Von Nguyen Giap, the North Vietnamese commander who'd beaten the French at Dien Bien Phu, began moving heavy artillery into position north of the DMZ throughout the spring and summer of 1967. This wasn't the usual collection of mortars and rockets that Viet Cong units used. This was real artillery, Soviet-made 130mm and 152mm guns. These weapons could fire from positions up to 17 kilometers away, which put them safely across the DMZ in North Vietnam where they were supposed to be off-limits to ground attack under the Geneva Accords. The guns were dug into fortified positions, protected by extensive trench systems and anti-aircraft defences. Some were placed in caves carved into the hills. The North Vietnamese were creating artillery sanctuaries, and they were aiming them all at Con Thien. The siege began in earnest in July 1967, though Marines at Con Thien had been taking fire since February. But July was when it became clear that this wasn't harassment. This was something else entirely. On July 2nd, a Marine patrol from Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines walked into a carefully prepared ambush about a mile northwest of Con Thien. The North Vietnamese 80th Battalion hit them with everything they had: small arms, machine guns, mortars, and then the artillery started falling. The company took 84 casualties, killed and wounded, in less than 90 minutes. It was the worst single day of losses for the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines up to that point in the war. Over the next 2 weeks, Marine patrols around Con Thien ran into increasingly heavy resistance. The North Vietnamese weren't running away anymore. They were standing and fighting using the same tactics they'd perfected against the French. Draw the Americans into prepared killing zones, hit them with overwhelming fire, inflict maximum casualties, then break contact before American artillery and air support could turn the tables. And always, the artillery kept firing at Con Thien itself. The base at this point held roughly 600 Marines from the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, along with supporting units. The perimeter measured about 700 metres across, ringed with barbed wire, trenches and fighting positions. But those fighting positions weren't the deep bunkers you might imagine. The red laterite soil mixed with clay gave way to solid rock just a few feet down. Engineers with jackhammers could barely make progress, so most positions were sandbag bunkers built up rather than dug down, which meant they were vulnerable to direct hits from artillery shells that came screaming in at near vertical angles. On September 2nd, 1967, the North Vietnamese kicked things into high gear. They dropped more than 200 rounds of mixed artillery and mortar fire onto Con Thien in a single day. 4 Marines died, 19 were wounded, and that was just the beginning. September would turn out to be the worst month of the siege. The shelling became constant. Some days saw over 1,000 incoming rounds. The sound never stopped. Even when the actual explosions paused, you could hear the distant thump of guns firing from across the DMZ, which gave you maybe 20 to 30 seconds to find cover before the shells arrived. A Marine lieutenant later described it this way: you'd hear the gunfire, then you'd count. If you got to 30, you might be okay, but if you only got to 15 or 20, that shell was coming right at you, and all you could do was get as low as possible and hope the sandbags held. After a while, the counting became automatic. Your brain did it without conscious thought, like breathing, and every single count that ended with an explosion close by meant somebody might be dead or wounded. The Marines called artillery fire in 2 categories: harassment and interdiction fire, or H&I, which was random shelling meant to keep you nervous and prevent normal operations, and concentrated fire, which meant they were trying to kill specific targets. Con Thien got both, all day, every day. H&I fire would scatter across the base at random intervals, making it impossible to predict when the next shell would land. You couldn't establish any rhythm or routine. Chow time, sleep time, resupply operations, everything happened under fire, and then, without warning, the random fire would stop and concentrated barrages would hammer specific sections of the perimeter, or the command post or the landing zone. The North Vietnamese clearly had observers watching the base, calling in corrections, turning their guns on any target that presented itself. Now, let me tell you about what those impacts actually did to human bodies and what it was like to live through it day after day. Because the statistics about shell counts don't capture the reality of what Marines endured. A 130mm shell weighs about 73 pounds, with roughly 20 pounds of high explosive. When it detonates, the blast wave travels faster than sound, hitting you before you hear the explosion. If you're close enough, the overpressure alone can rupture your lungs, your eardrums, your internal organs, without any shrapnel touching you. If you're further out, the shell casing fragments into thousands of pieces of jagged metal, travelling at thousands of feet per second. These fragments, called shrapnel, can kill at distances of over 200 meters. A single shell has enough shrapnel to wound or kill every person within a 30-meter radius if they're caught in the open. The Marines at Con Thien learned very quickly that there were different types of impacts with different results. A shell that hit soft ground, even shallow ground, would bury itself a foot or two before detonating. The earth would absorb some of the blast and shrapnel, creating a crater and throwing up a geyser of dirt, but potentially leaving people nearby only wounded rather than dead. A shell that hit rock or hardpan would detonate on the surface, sending shrapnel parallel to the ground in every direction, like a lawnmower blade made of supersonic metal. Those were the ones that killed multiple Marines at once, And worst of all were the shells that hit trench lines or bunker roofs directly. The explosion would funnel down into the confined space, and everyone inside would die from overpressure even if the structure didn't collapse. Medical evacuations became nearly impossible during heavy shelling. Helicopters couldn't land when artillery was falling on the landing zone, so wounded Marines would lie in aid stations, sometimes for hours, waiting for a break in the fire that might not come. Corpsmen did what they could with the supplies they had, but combat medicine in 1967 wasn't what it would become later in the war. If you took shrapnel to the gut or the chest and couldn't get evacuated quickly, your chances weren't good. By mid-September, the casualty count was climbing past 300 killed and wounded. The base itself was being systematically destroyed. Bunkers that took days to build would disappear in seconds when shells found them. The landing zone, critical for resupply and medevac, was cratered so badly that helicopters struggled to find flat ground. Engineers would fill craters and grade the LZ during brief lulls, only to watch their work get blown apart again hours later. Everything at Con Thien existed in a constant cycle of construction, destruction, and reconstruction. The psychological toll was just as brutal as the physical damage. Sleep deprivation became chronic. You couldn't sleep through artillery fire, and even during quiet periods, your body stayed wound tight, waiting for the next barrage. Marines developed what they called the 1,000-yard stare, a blank expression that came from being too exhausted and too traumatized to show emotion anymore. Some men stopped caring about incoming fire, walking around the base during shellings with a fatalistic attitude that they'd either get hit or they wouldn't, and diving for cover wouldn't change anything. Others became hyper-vigilant, flinching at every sound, unable to function between barrages. The Marine Corps tried everything they could think of to stop the shelling, or at least reduce it. Artillery units fired counter-battery missions constantly, trying to locate and destroy the North Vietnamese guns. But the enemy positions were well protected, and the guns would fire a few rounds, then move or go silent before American artillery could zero in on them. Air Force and Navy aircraft flew hundreds of sorties dropping bombs on suspected gun positions, north of the DMZ, but without ground observers to confirm the locations. Most strikes hit empty jungle or decoy positions. The most controversial response was Operation Neutralize, launched on September 11th. The plan was to use massive firepower, including B-52 strikes, to destroy enemy artillery positions and troop concentrations around Con Thien. Over the next month, American forces dropped more than 40,000 tons of bombs and fired over 150,000 artillery rounds at suspected enemy positions. It was one of the most concentrated applications of firepower in the entire war. And it barely made a difference. The shelling of Con Thien continued almost unabated. What the North Vietnamese were doing was simple but effective. They'd learned that American forces relied heavily on air and artillery support, so they built their positions to withstand bombing, used terrain and weather to limit American airstrikes, and accepted their own casualties as the cost of achieving their objective. And their objective wasn't actually to capture Con Thien. It was to make holding it so costly that the Americans would abandon the McNamara Line concept entirely. They were playing a longer game. The monsoon season arrived in October, bringing low clouds and rain that grounded aircraft for days at a time. The base turned into a sea of mud, trenches filled with water, bunkers leaked. Resupply became even more difficult because helicopters couldn't fly in bad weather, and ground convoys from Dong Ha to Con Thien had to run a gauntlet of ambushes and minefields along Route 9. There were times when Con Thien was effectively cut off, running low on ammunition, food and medical supplies, with wounded Marines waiting days for evacuation. On October 4th, the North Vietnamese launched a ground probe against the base's perimeter. It wasn't a full-scale assault, but it proved they could get close enough to attack if they wanted to. The Marines beat it back with small arms and artillery, but the message was clear. Con Thien could be overrun if the North Vietnamese were willing to pay the price, and the artillery fire that rained down before, during and after the probe suggested they might be preparing to do exactly that. Intelligence reports indicated that 2 full North Vietnamese regiments, the 96th and 324th, were positioned near Con Thien with a 3rd, the 82nd, close enough to reinforce. That meant potentially 6,000 to 7,000 enemy soldiers within striking distance of a base held by 600 Marines. If they attacked during a heavy shelling, during bad weather when air support couldn't respond, the mathematics were grim. General Robert Cushman, commander of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, made the decision that probably saved Con Thien. He positioned additional artillery batteries within range of the base and coordinated with the Air Force for immediate response protocols. Any ground attack on Con Thien would be met with everything available: multiple artillery batteries, tactical airstrikes, naval gunfire from destroyers offshore, and B-52 strikes if needed. The North Vietnamese would pay such a high price for overrunning Con Thien that even victory would be defeat. Whether the North Vietnamese ever seriously planned a ground assault remains debated. What's clear is that by late October, the intensity of the shelling began to decrease. The monsoon made large-scale operations difficult for both sides. The Americans had demonstrated they wouldn't abandon Con Thien no matter how much punishment it took. And the McNamara Line, the actual reason for all of this, was already being quietly shelved. The barrier would never be completed. The strong-point obstacle system would become a historical footnote, remembered mainly for the blood it cost at places like Con Thien. The official end of the siege is usually marked as November 1967, though shelling continued at reduced levels well into 1968. By the time it was over, Con Thien had absorbed somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 rounds of artillery and mortar fire. Casualty figures vary depending on which time period you're counting and which units you include. The commonly cited number is over 1,400 killed and wounded, though some sources put it higher. What's certain is that for every Marine who spent time at Con Thien during those months, the experience left scars that never fully healed. Let me tell you about some of the men who earned the highest recognition for what they did during those months of constant bombardment. Their stories illustrate both the horror and the heroism that defined Con Thien. Corporal William Morgan of the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, was manning an observation post north of Con Thien on February 25, 1967, early in what would become the siege. His position took a direct hit from artillery fire that killed 2 Marines and wounded several others. Morgan himself took shrapnel wounds, but refused evacuation. For the next 2 hours, while under continued artillery and mortar fire, he treated wounded Marines, organised their evacuation, and maintained his position's defence. When North Vietnamese soldiers attempted to overrun the position during the confusion, Morgan directed defensive fire that drove them back. He stayed at his post until the last wounded Marine was evacuated, only then accepting treatment for his own wounds. He survived his injuries and received the Navy Cross. Private First Class Douglas Dickey served with the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, during heavy fighting near Con Thien in March 1967. His platoon was pinned down by North Vietnamese forces in fortified positions. Dickey's squad leader was killed, and the squad's advance had stalled under heavy fire. Dickey grabbed an M72 Law rocket and charged toward the enemy bunker, firing at his unit. He destroyed the bunker with his first rocket, then ran to another position under fire, grabbed a second Law and destroyed a second bunker. He was moving toward a third fortified position when he was killed by enemy fire. His actions had broken the enemy's defence and allowed his platoon to advance. He received the Navy Cross posthumously. Captain James Livingston led his company through some of the fiercest fighting of the entire siege during Operation Buffalo in July 1967. His company was ordered to relieve a surrounded unit north of Con Thien that had been trapped by the North Vietnamese 80th Battalion. Livingston led his men across open ground under sustained artillery, mortar, and small arms fire. When they reached the trapped Marines, his company found itself surrounded as well, with North Vietnamese forces attacking from 3 sides. Livingston personally led multiple counterattacks, exposing himself to enemy fire to direct his Marines and coordinate supporting arms. He was wounded but refused evacuation. Over the next 2 days, his company held its position and fought off repeated assaults while evacuating both the wounded from the original surrounded unit and their own casualties. When relief finally arrived, Livingston had been wounded twice more but was still commanding his company. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions during Operation Buffalo. What these stories illustrate is that the fighting around Con Thien wasn't just Marines sitting in bunkers enduring artillery fire. There were constant patrols, constant skirmishes, constant attempts by both sides to control the terrain around the base. The North Vietnamese wanted to isolate Con Thien and make resupply impossible. The Marines needed to maintain a security perimeter and prevent enemy forces from getting close enough for a ground assault. This meant daily patrols into areas where the North Vietnamese had prepared ambushes. It meant small unit actions where squads and platoons found themselves outnumbered and fighting for survival. And it meant casualties that accumulated day by day week by week. The living conditions at Con Thien during the siege were about as miserable as conditions could get while still technically being alive. The base had no running water beyond what could be trucked in, or, during the monsoon, collected from rain. No showers, no proper latrines, just holes in the ground that flooded when it rained. No hot food most of the time because field kitchens couldn't operate during shelling, which was most of the time. Marines ate sea rations, often cold because heating them meant exposing yourself during preparation time. The red dust when it was dry turned everything and everyone the same rust colour. It got in your weapons, your food, your lungs. Then when the monsoon came, the dust turned to mud that was somehow worse. The mud would suck boots off feet. It made trenches into canals. It rotted clothing and webbing. Skin infections were common because you couldn't stay clean. Foot problems like immersion foot were epidemic because your boots were never dry. Rats were everywhere. They fed. On garbage, sea ration trash, and worse. They'd run across you while you tried to sleep. They carried disease. Same with the flies. The jungle around Con Thien was infested with mosquitoes that carried malaria. Despite anti-malarial pills, despite mosquito repellent, Marines contracted malaria and other tropical diseases at rates that added to the casualty counts, even though they weren't combat wounds. The psychological environment was unique compared to other Vietnam battles. At places like Hue City or in the A Shau Valley, combat came in intense bursts, brutal fighting, then movement to another area, another mission. At Con Thien there was no relief. You stayed in place while the enemy rained steel on you day after day. There was no safe area. The command bunker got hit, the aid station got hit, the LZ got hit, your fighting position got hit. Sooner or later, everything got hit. The only question was whether you'd be in it when the shell landed. This created a specific kind of trauma that was different from other combat stress. There was nothing you could do to fight back against artillery. You couldn't shoot at it. You couldn't maneuver against it. You could only endure. And humans aren't built for that kind of passive acceptance of death. We're built to fight or flee. At Con Thien you could do neither. You just waited for the next shell and hoped it would miss. The Marines who rotated through Con Thien during the siege came from multiple battalions. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, took the brunt of the summer fighting. The 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, spent time there in the fall. The 9th Marines overall, spread across multiple battalions, probably saw the most time at Con Thien and took the highest casualties. They earned the nickname The Walking Dead because their casualty rates in the DMZ area were so high that being assigned to the 9th Marines felt like a death sentence. By the time the siege wound down in November and December of 1967, Con Thien had achieved nothing of strategic value. The McNamara Line was dead. The base would continue to exist as a fire support base and patrol base, but its role as a key strongpoint in a barrier system evaporated. Marines would continue to man Con Thien through 1968 and into 1969, taking casualties the whole time, but never again would it face the sustained hell of those 3 months in 1967. The North Vietnamese achieved their objective. They proved that static defences near the DMZ were unsustainable. They forced the Americans to abandon the barrier concept, and they did it by using the same tactics they'd used against the French at Dien Bien Phu. Concentrate artillery on a fixed position, make it unbearable, force the enemy to either evacuate or suffer unsustainable casualties. The difference was that at Dien Bien Phu the French eventually surrendered. At Con Thien the Marines stayed. They took the punishment and stayed. Whether that was courage or stubbornness or simply following orders is for each person who was there to decide for themselves. When journalists asked Marines at Con Thien what it was like, the answers were usually short. Because what do you say about spending 3 months being shelled? How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it does to you to live with constant fear, constant noise, constant death? Some Marines tried to make jokes about it. Others just shook their heads and didn't answer. A few gave real answers that were darker than anything newspapers would print. One sergeant told a reporter that the worst part wasn't the shells, it was the waiting between shells. Because during the explosions you were too busy dealing with the immediate crisis to think. But in the quiet periods, your mind would race through all the ways you might die, all the positions that might get hit next, all the friends you'd already lost. The shells killed your body, the waiting. Between shells killed your mind. Con Thien was finally abandoned as a permanent base in 1969. The Marines pulled out, blew the bunkers, and left. The hill reverted to jungle. Today, if you visit the area, there's almost nothing left to show that 600 Americans once lived there, and endured 3 months of hell defending a piece of ground that was strategically worthless. The craters have filled in, the bunkers have collapsed, the wire has rusted away, the Hill of Angels is just a hill again. But for the Marines who were there, Con Thien never really ended. The sound stayed with them. The smell of explosives stayed with them. The faces of friends who died stayed with them. Some came home and built good lives despite the memories. Others never really came home at all, their minds still trapped on that red hill, still counting the seconds between the gunfiring and the shell landing. The Siege of Con Thien doesn't have the name recognition of Khe Sanh or the Ia, Drang Valley or Hue City. It doesn't show up in movies or video games. Most Americans have never heard of it, but for the Marines who lived through it, Con Thien was as real and as terrible as any battle in any war. And when you look at the numbers, over 1,400 casualties, 15 to 20,000 rounds of incoming fire, 3 solid months of sustained bombardment, you understand why the Marines who were there called it worse than Khe Sanh. Because at Khe Sanh, the world was watching. Reporters were everywhere. The siege made headlines every day. When it ended, the Marines who survived were treated like heroes. At Con Thien, the world wasn't watching. The siege happened in relative obscurity. When it ended, there were no victory parades. The Marines who survived just rotated to their next assignment or went home, carrying their trauma privately because nobody outside the Corps really knew what they'd been through. That might be the final injustice of Con Thien, that so much suffering happened for so little purpose and received so little recognition. The McNamara Line that Con Thien was supposed to anchor was a bad idea from the start, opposed by the people who would have to man it, pushed through by civilians who didn't understand Vietnam or how the North Vietnamese fought. And when the concept failed, as the Marines knew it would, the politicians and planners moved on to the next bad idea. But the Marines who paid for that failure in blood and sanity didn't get to move on. They stayed on that hill until they were told to leave, and then they carried it with them for the rest of their lives. So when you hear about Vietnam, when you hear about Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive and the fall of Saigon, remember that there were other battles, other sieges, other places where Americans fought and died that never made it into the history books most people read. Remember Con Thien. Remember the Hill of Angels. Remember the Marines who spent 3 months under constant artillery fire defending a hill that didn't matter because they were told to defend it. They did their job. They held their ground. They endured what would break most people, and they deserve to be remembered for it.